The neck is an extension of the trunk upwards to hold the head. What does the neck contain? The neck contains vertebral column, the cervical part of the vertebral column. Now, around this vertebral column, there are many muscles. The ones in front of the vertebral column are called prevertebral muscles. The muscles posterior to the vertebral column are called postvertebral muscles. Now, these are many muscles, and we are not going to address them. We are going to forget them. When we study muscles of the neck, we are going to study only the key muscles. Now, the neck also contains arteries, veins, nerves, and organs. What organs are present in the neck? They are the pharynx, the esophagus, the larynx, the trachea, the thyroid. So the neck is a constricted part of the trunk that is very crowded with several structures. Where is the neck? The neck is lying between the clavicles inferiorly. Anything above the clavicles is part of the neck till as you go up to the margins of the mandible. So the neck extends from the clavicles to the margin of the mandible. Under the skin of the neck, there is a pair of muscles. These muscles are called the platysma, one on the right and one on the left. From where do they come? They come from the part below the clavicles, the part over the pectoralis major, and the muscle is present subcutaneously, and these two muscles, they go up to the margins of the mandible and then extend to the angles of the mouth. This is the action of the platysma. When it contracts, it pulls the angles of the mouth downward and laterally, and the skin of the neck becomes wrinkled. Now, the platysma is a common site for Botox injection because wrinkles appear in the neck. This is our starting point in studying muscles of the neck, because in order to study the blood vessels, the structures, the veins, the nerves, we have to divide the neck into triangles. And these two muscles, the sternocleidomastoid muscle, which is a very important landmark in the neck, in addition to a muscle called omohyoid, these two muscles divide the neck into triangles. So these are two important landmarks in the neck. This is a frontolateral view of the neck, and we can see that there are several key muscles that are going to divide the neck into triangles. These triangles are very useful in describing structures of the neck, and each triangle has its own name and it contains specific structures. We will start with the most important landmark in the neck, and this muscle is going to take origin from the sternum, called the sternal head, and fibers go up, and there is another head coming from the medial part of the clavicle that is called clavicular head, and these two heads join together and go up obliquely to the mastoid process that is just behind the ear part of the temporal bone and the lateral part of the occipital bone, the external surface. And this muscle is called the sternocleido for clavicle mastoid. It is easier and most useful name for this muscle is sternomastoid as a shorter name. Then when we finish with this important landmark muscle, the sternomastoid, we come to another muscle that is going to take origin from the hyoid bone. What is the hyoid bone? The hyoid bone is a horseshoe bone made of a body and wings, and it is within the curve of the mandible. So the lateral part of the body of the hyoid bone is going to give attachment to a muscle that goes down and laterally, and then it is going to disappear deep to the sternomastoid. Now, what is going to happen deep to the sternomastoid? It is going to have an intermediate tendon which is tethered or attached to the deep structures, and then after the intermediate tendon, another belly of muscle which is going to appear lateral to the sternomastoid and goes to the superior border of scapula. And this muscle is called omohyoid. Omo for scapula and the hyoid for the hyoid bone. Then we get rid of this omohyoid muscle, and then we have a third muscle that comes from anterior part of the inner surface of the mandible and then reaches the body of the hyoid, and this is called the anterior belly of this muscle, and then it is tethered or it is attached to the body of the hyoid bone by a fibrous ring, and at this area it has an intermediate tendon, and then from there the posterior part or the posterior belly will go upward and posteriorly to be attached to a special area interior to the mastoid process, and this muscle is called digastric. That means it has two fusiform belly shape parts. Here is another view of the omohyoid, where you can see that here is the superior belly of omohyoid coming from the body of hyoid bone, and as it goes down and posteriorly, this is called the superior belly, and then deep to the sternomastoid muscle comes the inferior belly, which is going to the scapula. This is the omohyoid muscle, an important landmark muscle in the neck. This is another view. There is no harm in repeating important information. This is the sternomastoid lower part. And what is this? These are the two heads, the one of the right and the other for the left. From the sternum, these are the sternal heads. And then this is the clavicular head of the two sternomastoids. And then they join together and they go to the mastoid process. This image is telling me that when one side of the sternomastoid is contracting, the jaw moves to the other side and the ear approaches the tip of the shoulder, and the jaw goes away from the side of contraction. This is the action of the sternomastoid when a single one contracts, and it does flexion of the vertebral column of the cervical region, a kind of flexion called lateral flexion. Why don't we write notes of what we have seen about the sternocleidomastoid? It is easier to call it the sternomastoid muscle, and it's important to generate information by asking at least 5 questions. So, how many heads are there in the sternomastoid? There is a sternal head from anterior surface of manubrium sterni, and there is a clavicular head from the medial 1/3 of the clavicle, and all these points of origin will send the muscle to the mastoid process, plus the lateral 1/2 of the superior knuckle line, which is a feature of the external surface of the occipital bone. And what does it do? It draws the mastoid process down towards the same side. The chin will turn and move to the opposite side, and when they act together, the muscles of the two sides will flex the neck. Another group of landmark muscles are the muscles that are called the scalenes, and there are 3 of them. There is the anterior scalene muscle, the middle one, and a posterior one. So the anterior comes from the anterior tubercle of transverse process of cervical vertebra and inserts into the upper surface of the first rib, called the scalene tubercle, and we have seen that when we studied the first rib. The middle scalene muscle attaches also from upper cervical vertebrae and also inserts into the first rib, and the posterior one inserts into the second rib. What is the action of the scalenes? When, for example, the right side of this image is contracting, you can see that the mandible goes to the same side. Let us summarize some notes about the scalene muscles. The scalenus anterior, what about it? It's an important landmark in the neck. What does it do? It elevates the first rib and flexes the neck laterally. It comes from anterior tubercle of the transverse process of C3, 4, 5, and 6 and attaches to the scalene tubercle of the first rib present on its superior surface, and it is supplied by spinal nerve C5, 6, and 7. These are notes about the scalenus medius, and what does it do? It elevates the first rib and does the same thing as the scalenus anterior, and because the scalenus anterior and medius, they are attached to the first rib, they elevate the first rib when the cervical vertebral column is fixed, and therefore they become an accessory muscles of respiration and in the inspiratory phase. The anterior comes from the anterior tubercles of transverse process, and the medius comes from the posterior tubercles of higher cervical vertebrae, and they insert into the first rib and supplied by plexus of nerves from the neck. These are notes about the scalenus posterior. Scalenus posterior is not always present in every single person. Sometimes it is not existing, and it elevates the first rib and flexes the neck, and because it is attached to a rib, it is an accessory muscle of respiration, and it arises from transverse process of cervical vertebra and attaches to the second rib. The first, the anterior and the middle, they attach to the first rib, while scalenus posterior attaches to the second rib. This is a lateral view of the neck where there is a muscle marked green. This muscle extends from upper cervical vertebrae, transverse processes, and if you look down, it is inserting into the superior medial angle of the scapula, and when this muscle contracts, it is going to do what? It elevates the scapula. Therefore, the proper name for this muscle is levator scapulae. What is this view? This is a posterior view of the skull and cervical spines, and we can see a muscle in the upper part taking origin from transverse processes of cervical C1, C2, C3, and C4, and they join together and form a muscle to attach to the superior medial angle of the scapula, and this muscle is the levator scapulae. Why don't we write a few notes about levator scapulae. What does it do? Elevates the scapula. From where does it come? It comes from transverse processes of C1, C2, C3, and C4, and it goes to the medial border of the scapula from the superior angle, and then it is supplied by what is called dorsal scapular nerve. Let's analyze another muscle which is going to give us triangles in the neck. This muscle is coming from the mastoid process, on the inside of the mastoid process, and there is a belly, a posterior belly, and then it comes towards the hyoid, and there is an arch of fibrous tissue that attaches or hooks the central tendon or the intermediate tendon into the body of hyoid bone, and then the anterior part of the muscle, which is going to insert into the inside of the most front part of the mandible, and this is the digastric muscle. Then we have this muscle arising from the body of the hyoid bone and goes to the mandible and makes the floor of the mouth. Therefore, this is called the mylohyoid muscle. So what is the mylohyoid muscle? It elevates the hyoid bone and the tongue, and when the hyoid bone is fixed, it depresses the mandible. From where is it attached? Mylohyoid line of the mandible, and there is a middle raphe between the right and the left, and it is supplied by mandibular division of trigeminal nerve. And this muscle is called thyrohyoid muscle. These muscles are called strap muscles because they look like a ribbon. We need to write notes about the sternohyoid, the muscle that looks like a ribbon extending from the hyoid, the posterior surface of manubrium up to the hyoid bone. And what does it do? It depresses and stabilizes the hyoid bone, and it is covering the sternothyroid and thyrohyoid, and the posterior surface of both manubrium and sternal ends of the clavicle are the points of origin of this muscle, and the lower border of the hyoid bone, and it is medial to the omohyoid insertion. This is where it is attached to the hyoid bone, and it is supplied by a nerve called ansa cervicalis. Writing notes is very important because it fixes the information that we have observed. And these are the notes about the omohyoid, and by now you should be able to write it down, or at least you go through it very quickly. Don't forget writing notes after you observe an image or a structure. And these are basic facts about the thyrohyoid. It extends from the external line of the thyroid cartilage to the hyoid bone, and these are the basic information about this muscle.